Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is John Tribus. I'm the Managing Director of Georgetown University's Center for Social Impact Communication. I'm also an adjunct professor here at the university. You're not going to hear them today, but I also want to acknowledge my colleagues, Denise Keys, the Executive Director and Founder of the Center, as well as Kimberly Hayes, the Center's Program Coordinator. I also see a lot of our former colleagues are on today's webinar, so nice to see familiar faces, as well as a lot of current Georgetown students, as well as alums. So welcome to everybody. If you're not as familiar with the center, I want to give you a very brief overview. The Center for Social Impact Communication is an applied research and action center, and we're dedicated to increasing social impact through the power of marketers, communicators, fundraisers, and journalists working together. So we have a de facto tagline, and that is embracing the blur for good. Embracing the blur for good really is our philosophy. We believe that these functions need to come better together, work with human strengths in order to drive even more social impact. And so as we explore those issues, we bring them to life in a number of different ways. We certainly bring them life through applied research, which is why you're here today to hear about our latest research report. But we also do so by creating and teaching graduate courses at Georgetown University, community collaborations. We work with a lot of social impact organizations, nonprofit and otherwise, not only in Washington, D.C., but also across the country. Through our work, we've donated tens of $millions worth of pro bono services that we're really proud of. And we also do thought leadership, articles, and gatherings such as this, really to work to bring the sector and the community together. So we're always up to something really excited. If you'd like to learn more, please check out our website. You see the address there on the screen. And I'm also really excited to announce one of our new projects that we're working on is the launch of a certificate program in social impact storytelling. And that will launch fall of this year, starting in September. You won't find any information online just yet about that certificate, but more information and the official launch will be happening in the next few weeks. So I hope you'll be on the lookout for that. Without further ado, I want to introduce today's presenter, today's speaker, who I call, Evan, I don't even know if you know this, I call you the brain guy.
Oh, great. Hey, wonderful.
So Evan Parker is going to give you more of an introduction of himself, but he is the brain guy. He also has a day job, and he teaches within our programs here at Georgetown. So Evan, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're also going to take questions throughout the program. So if you put questions as they come up in the Q&A, I'm going to come back at the end, and we're going to ask Evan some of those questions at the conclusion of today's program, which is going to be approximately an hour in length. So Evan, go ahead and take it away.
Hi, thanks. Welcome, welcome. Before I get started, I want to give you a little bit of an introduction. My name is Evan Parker. I've got kind of a bizarrely diverse background in talking to supporter audiences in the nonprofit space, from online volunteer mobilization in the days before websites had pictures, to constituent communications for a certain member of Congress who had a very nice run for the presidency last year, to advocacy campaigns, to 7 years doing integrated fundraising for the Nature Conservancy, to nonprofit messaging and rebranding efforts with a PR firm, to several years in a nerdery helping nonprofits segment and use their data. At Georgetown, I teach a class on activating cause audiences in the School of Continuing Studies, which is, and my class is part of two programs here, the Master's in PR and Corporate Communications and the Master's in Integrated Marketing Campaigns. In the class, we talk about how people want to talk to their nonprofits and how nonprofits can best communicate with their supporters. In my copious amounts of free time, besides being a fellow here, I also head up the clients and accounts for Every Action. It's an online software platform that helps nonprofits and political campaigns engage with their audiences, from email to online fundraising to voter file-based canvassing to FEC compliance to direct mail and news management. So across my 2 decades in this space, I've seen a lot of assumptions. Every day, people like you and I rely on these assumptions to motivate our supporter audiences. And assumptions are great, and they're often built on years of our experiences. But there's this thing called confirmation bias, where our brain seeks out data that confirms what we already believe to be true and ignores data that would shake that worldview. And this is more than just liberals refusing to watch Fox News. Every day we pay the most attention to the things that make us feel like we've got a pretty good grasp on the world around us. It saves us time and energy, and by not making us think about each little thing each and every time. As a result, we actually have to struggle to challenge our brains and the assumptions, or we run the risk of doing a whole bunch of things that may not actually work. This is the foundation the project was built on. Is there any proof that the assumptions we rely on every day actually works to motivate our supporters to do good in the world? If nonprofits can't always afford in time or money to test everything, is there some social science we can rely on to lighten that load? The nonprofit world is littered with tales of gut marketers, communicators, even fundraisers sometimes, who make decisions based on what they think will work best instead of what we know and we can prove will work best. For instance, few serious people argue with the idea that people inherently want to do good. When we think about why people want to do good, and if they think about it at all, they often attribute this goodness to some vague notion that people are just inherently altruistic. It's what our parents taught us to do when we were little kids, to share and be nice to others. It's in the stories and parables of churches, mosques, synagogues we go to every week to inspire us to be good people. We see evidence of altruism every day, like a person jumping into a subway tracks to save someone, or a professor giving his life barricading his students from an attack by a gunman. We see these acts and thousands more like them every day and assume that this level of virtue guides each and every one of our supporters too. We think each of the billions of dollars Americans give to charity each year is given because it's the right thing to do, to selflessly benefit people that we'll never know. But many of us, most of us even, have motivations that fall a bit closer to home. We want to make the world better, but we also want to make the world better for people we know, or even ourselves. We want our communities to be safe, prosperous, and healthy. We feel good when we do good, and we enjoy to be recognized as a good person. Regardless of the fact that we buckle under the 24-hour news cycle ourselves and a barrage of asks from our friends and family, from marketers, from other organizations, we behave as if our organizations are at the very center of our supporters' lives, that they are literally sitting around waiting for us to ask them to do something. We speak as if we live in an information economy where content is king and information always wins out. But information isn't scarce. It's everywhere, and it's impossible to keep up with. And as newspapers smaller than the Washington Post and the New York Times are struggling with, information is not something that people are willing to pay for anymore, in time or in money. The resource that is scarce is actually our attention. Our attention's limited by the number of minds on the planet, and even if we add more minds, we add the competition for that attention of those minds. And those minds are limited in what we can do. We can only have a handful of thoughts in our heads at once. We can only handle so many stable relationships before people and organizations start falling off the back of our social bus. We're bombarded with hundreds, if not thousands, of marketing messages every day. And we consume 10 plus hours of media each and every day. As a result, we have to treat our communications as if they're a contact sport. Otherwise, the email that we just sent barely has a chance. One of the most common mistakes and assumptions we can make is assuming our supporters care about our organization as much as they care about their cause. How many times have you gotten an email saying an organization just needs $10,000 by midnight to meet some artificial internal organizational goal that they've set for themselves? How many people actually care about your organization versus the outcomes they bring? And frankly, how many people actually knows who your organization is? One of my memories from the Nature Conservancy came from a person who called up our member care line and demanded to know why they hadn't gotten the little stuffed tiger we had promised them. It was awkward when the caller when we had to tell the caller that we don't actually do stuffed tigers and that they probably wanted to call the World Wildlife Fund instead. When we think about altruism and empathy and about efficacy, your supporters are doing things for themselves or others or for the outcomes they seek. They're looking to signal something to the world about themselves. What they aren't doing is they aren't doing it to support your organization. In their minds, the organization is a means, not the ends. For instance, do you shop at Whole Foods to support the Whole Foods brand, or do you do it because you want organic fruit? The brands that we support are just a tool in our toolbox. As long as the tool works, our supporters are happy to keep using it. But the moment our supporter feels our organizations aren't working for them, they very quickly move on to find a different tool in the toolbox that will. So ultimately, that's what we did in this project. We wanted to take the assumptions we have, test them against decades of social science, behavioral economics, even a little bit of neuroscience to see what sticks and what needs to be overthrown. To do that, we conducted dozens of interviews with academic and practitioner experts. We reviewed over 200 published papers and white papers. We interviewed 24 organizations and thought leaders. Now, this document's not intended to be a peer-reviewed scientific paper, so it should, the good news is that it should do a good job of keeping you awake as you read it. Instead, it's intended to be well-researched, but pragmatic guide to what you can do to better engage your supporters. So let's go through 7 of the key strategies that we documented as part of the project. So we know that people don't wake up in the morning hoping to help an organization meet its internal goals. They wake up looking to address some injustice they've identified in the world, and they want a partner, hopefully in our organization, to help them do so. Our supporters are not helping us with our mission. We are helping our supporters with theirs. And if we're not the center of our supporters' universe, and we're not, then maybe the most important thing we can do is to tell our stories differently. Part of this is explaining what needs to happen, not what our organization needs to happen, but what's broken in the real world that needs to be fixed. We don't need to raise $10,000 by midnight. Instead, there are 100,000 people who need bed nets tonight so they don't succumb to malaria. An easy way to check this in your own work is by making sure that we're using the right pronouns. When we say things like us and our, we're probably leaving the supporters on the sidelines of the story, making your organization the protagonist, as in help us save lives. Instead, think about using you and we, as in you want to save lives, and donate today and you'll save them. People are the protagonist in their own life story, and you, as the nonprofit, are existing as part of their story. It's not the other way around. We seem to want people to be motivated by purely altruistic reasons, and a slice of people probably are, but it's much more complicated than that. Scientists have found that doing good makes us feel good. It activates the same centers in our brain that are activated when we look at an attractive face or a beautiful work of art. Oddly enough, charity actually activates the same reward centers as using cocaine. But if people are purely focused on helping charities without any sense of reward to themselves, they'd be just as happy with $50 forcibly taxed out of their paychecks to support the United Way than deciding to make that donation on their own free will, which is not the case. So instead of assuming our supporters are selfless, or selfish, we should be communicating for a wide range of motivations and not inadvertently limit our supporters by making them pass some sort of purity test. Think about the jobs page on your website. You know, chances are it's ugly and horrible and utterly devoid of inspiring content, even though it's probably one of the top 5 most visited sections of your site. Most of us completely dismiss it, and yet it's read by people who are quite literally willing to give their lives over to our cause. We shouldn't punish these people for being selfish. Instead, let's think about how we can give them content that both needs and inspires them to do something more, like go for a bird walk at the preserve they're looking at, or volunteer at the pound where they applied for a job. So when we think about these motivations, how many emails in your inbox right now are asking you to donate now because sick children should have a chance at a normal life, or take action because polar bears are drowning from melting sea ice? These examples are based on the premise that people are motivated by what we call universalism. It's a selfless concern for others or animals that they'll likely never know. But universalism is just one of 10 basic human values. So nonprofits are inadvertently targeting a very narrow slice of our human motivations. People don't have to give to a food bank just to help people they'll never meet. Maybe instead they donate to make sure the food bank is there if their friends and family ever need it. People may not support after-school programs solely because of the benefit to at-risk youth, but because they know that keeping kids off of the street reduces crime, increases education in the community, and benefits their local economy. A good example of this is how science communications has evolved to convince people to act on climate change. At one point in the not so distant past, we spent a lot of time featuring appeals to universalism. Polar bears are drowning in the Arctic because of melting sea ice, or island communities under threat of rising sea levels in the Pacific. But the tide didn't start turning on climate change until we started featuring stories that moved beyond universalism and appealed to other human values. For example, our communities are under threat from extreme weather. Climate change is impacting our own health. We need a climate solution for our own economic development, or we need to stop climate change because we're stewards of God's creation. No one message is going to rule them all, or even maybe most. Instead, it's critical to use a range of messages so we can activate on the widest range of values that we can. The next time you hear about people implying how virtuous they are for supporting a nonprofit helping others, don't think of Mother Teresa. Think instead about the ball player at the press conference saying, "All I really want to do is help the team." It's possible their motivation truly is to help all their teammates achieve their goals, but it's more likely they knew that it sounded better to be charitable than to say, "I just wanted to pad my stats for contract time," or "I knew we couldn't win, but I was pretty sure I could still get some highlights on SportsCenter." Our supporters' motivations may be different than what they're telling us, but we're not jumping off a cliff blindly as we make the choice between pure and impure motivations. We know that altruistic language is more effective in public, meaning consumers were at a public event and or a volunteer opportunity with others. And we can open up to other more impure forms of altruism when their responses are private, as if they'd be in direct mail or email online appeals. But either way, we should never lead with selfish motivations. If you do, you're actually signaling to people that they're selfish if they respond. Instead, we start off with altruistic reasons about how they can help the cause. And after they already know that, then you start introducing more selfish benefits to seal the deal or help retain people over time. Altruism's only one side of the story. We spend a good time of looking at how and why people care for others too. Social scientists split our pop culture notions of concern for others into two main buckets, empathy and sympathy. Empathy is when one person perceives another's emotion and then feels that same emotion themselves. When we feel true empathy for someone, we feel what they feel. We project ourselves into the situation or circumstance, and their fear begets our own fear. Their anger becomes our anger. Their joy is our joy. Sympathy is more like what we'd expect from a greeting card aisle of a store. With sympathy, there is no shared emotion. Their fear, distress, or grief is met with our sorrow, concern, or pity. Empathy is a powerful driver of support for charity. People who see vivid emotional stories of a natural disaster victim are more likely to donate than those who just see facts and figures. People who hear an emotional story of their father losing their child to cancer show greater generosity than people who saw a less emotional presentation of the problem. Ultimately, humans empathize with other humans, and for the best, most authentic response, our supporters need to meet the individuals who are going to benefit from our organization's work through the stories that we tell. For more on storytelling, you should visit csicgeorgetown.edu and download the last research report we did, Stories Worth Telling. It takes you through all the ins and outs of telling a great story with examples and interviews and with social impact professionals. But in my work, research has shown that these stories will trigger more empathy if they do a couple of things. Empathy increases if our supporter has similar past experiences with the person depicted in the stories. The trick is finding the points where our donors and our beneficiaries have these shared needs and experiences. This is why food banks have stopped telling the stories of the permanently needy and are instead featuring the stories of people who need temporary food assistance. Most people who donate to food banks can't imagine needing food assistance every day of their lives, but they can easily imagine missing a paycheck or two and needing some assistance for a shorter period of time. Empathy also increases if the person feels similar to the person depicted, and that similarity can come from pretty much anything. That's why many nonprofit stories start with phrases like, "Little Susan loves science," or "playing soccer with her friends," or "Billy's family is just like any other. He has two parents who love him and work long hours to make sure he has food, clothes, and a roof over his head." These phrases are inserted specifically to reduce what social scientists call the social distance between supporter and supportee. When supporters feel they're distant from the people in need, not just different in location, but different in personality, life choices, etc., then you probably need to tell a different story. As with all things, the use of empathy can go too far. When someone becomes too empathetic, there's a chance they'll become less responsive as people stop listening to the message and instead focus on coping with the unpleasant feelings that have been evoked by the message. Social scientists call this a maladaptive response. Most of us have seen Sarah McLachlan talking about abused animals at 2 a.m. in the morning, know what a maladaptive response is. As soon as we see the first image or hear the first notes of music from the maker or the angel, we change the channel so we don't get too emotional and we don't feel compelled to get yet another midnight donation to them. We find it stressful to see other people in distress. And if we're too stressed, we start spending more time trying to discount the message than we do thinking about how we could make a difference. One place we see this is when we push a person's sense of responsibility too far, making them feel guilty instead of motivating them to act. Robert Cialdini tells the story of a guy in robes giving away flowers in an airport and guilting the recipient into making a donation. Cialdini is telling the story about the power of reciprocity. If the person keeps the flower, he feels compelled to do something in return. But Cialdini is also telling a story about guilt. You gave something to me, and I feel guilty if I don't return the favor. In this case, the person might make a donation, but they're only doing it to make the guy in the robes and the guilt go away. But in the process, the supporter is completely burned out by the experience and will now go to great lengths to make sure he or she is never put into that situation again. We also see this balance between hope and fear, the proverbial donate today or this baby seal's gonna get it. For fear to be effective, supporters need to understand the severity of the threat, believe that it's likely to occur, and most importantly, that it's within their power to save the baby seal. If we overstate the severity of the threat, overstate how likely it is to occur, or don't give them hope that they can fix the problem, then the supporter reacts badly and they're lost into a loop of these maladaptive responses. This last part, feeling hope that we can fix the issue, leads us to the most critical driver of nonprofit support. Nonprofits are very good at creating what social scientists call an awareness of need, which is basically determining what is broken and what needs to be fixed. Many times when organizations are trying to create an awareness of need, they barrage supporters with big numbers, incomprehensible statistics as proof of the severity of the situation. An approach that turns out to be counterproductive if people start feeling like there's no action they could take to make a difference. What supporters want is a feeling of efficacy, that they can do something and that doing something will make a difference, to move them from that awareness of need to being able and willing to do something about it. Earlier, when we were talking about guilt and fear, because too much of either can cause audience to become overwhelmed, we have to be careful. What's interesting is that the strong sense of positive efficacy actually reduces the chances of them getting overwhelmed in the first place. But the opposite, unfortunately, is also true. Too much negativity can make people think that nothing can be done to solve the problem and that there's little reason to even bother trying. But studies have shown that undermining efficacy isn't the only problem with negativity. The use of negativity, such as negative images and appeals, depress our supporters and suppress their responses. Negativity also seems to be short-lived, as studies of negative television ads show that after multiple screenings, they simply stop working. Repeated exposure to negative messaging leads to declining responses and eventually avoidance of the messages altogether, like in my 2 a.m. infomercial. And this long-term exposure to negative messages may damage the entire organization's reputation. As a result, people who go negative for their organizations typically aren't building a base of donors. They're getting a quick hit of money and then burning the file in the process. So even if you need to push through a little negativity to help supporters empathize with what the supportee has overcome, or to highlight the severity of an issue that's not on anybody's radar screen, you have to move very quickly from this agitation and towards positive hope that there is a solution. Showcasing this hope gets us further. Without that hope that we can solve the issue, there's little hope that our supporters will be along enough for us to try. I think everybody on this call knows that saying thank you is, of course, a good thing. So studies have shown that being thanked for doing something good promotes even more pro-social behavior in the future. What's interesting is some of the nuances behind saying thank you. Thanking people is a critical component of a two-way relationship with our supporters. People are happier when they're part of a partnership as opposed to one where they're being used like an ATM, and thank yous are a critical part of that. Gratitude also gives people a feeling of efficacy, that the actions that they're taking will be effective. When people have a sense of efficacy, they're willing to invest more in their lives and livelihoods into these pro-social behaviors because they feel like it'll make a difference. Finally, saying thank you gives us one more chance to show how effective our organization is, and also how effective the supporter is by choosing our organization as a partner. Testing has shown that there's a direct correlation between the number of times a donor has been thanked and how long they stay with our organizations. And it's not until 6 thank yous in a 12-month period that the return on saying thank you starts to level out. And if that's the case, most of our organizations have a very long way to go. One of the many old school skills that nonprofit fundraisers are taught early on in their careers is how to write a case for giving. At one point, these cases were big formal documents that cost organizations tens of thousands of dollars to create, and they'd run dozens, if not hundreds, of pages long. And as with all things written but never used, they were kept in large binders on the cubicle shelves above our desks. As it turned out, the case has a foundation in sound science. What's the need? Who benefits when the need is addressed? What can the supporter do? Why should the supporter act now? What is it about your organization that makes your organization uniquely able to help the supporter address the need? Every good piece of your content for your nonprofit will make sure your supporters have answers to these 5 key questions. For my students, it takes the better part of 5 weeks and 15 hours to lecture me all the way through a quality case for giving. So walking you through it in the time we have left today just isn't going to happen. But if you are interested, make sure you download the full text of our document from csic.georgetown.edu. The last chapter of the book covers cases like this in detail, including the roles that altruism, empathy, and efficacy play in your organization's best case for giving. So why don't we stop there and we can open it up for questions. For those who haven't downloaded the treatise yet, or you have but you want to get involved with the Center for Social Impact Communication, please visit us online at csic.georgetown.edu. Also, you can contact me by emailing evan.parker@georgetown.edu or via LinkedIn at the link you see above. So thank you for your time. And if you have questions, please put them into the chat mechanism. Okay, we're opening it up for questions now.
Okay, we have a number of questions coming in, Evan.
Great.
We did have a question. I can answer this first one. This is just about whether your presentation is going to be available afterwards, and the answer is yes. So as Evan already mentioned, you can download his research study right now on the research section of the CSIC website, and then we will be sending an email out shortly with the recording of this webinar as well. So Evan, we have a lot of questions going on with motivations and values. Are the same motivations at play with legislators when they make budget allocation decisions to nonprofits or public service entities?
Yeah, I often get questions about how much of this nonprofit work we're talking about applies to public policy, how much of it applies to the corporate space. And I think in the end, what I would say is all human beings are human beings, and we're all looking for the same things out of our lives, and we're all trying to do good in our own way, etc. So the very best way to get a legislature to change his or her mind on an issue is following these rules, telling them a great story with compelling examples and compelling beneficiaries, and then also providing some facts and figures behind it to back it up. There's actually two halves of a person's brain when they're making decisions. The first half is kind of the emotional half, where the Heath brothers refer to it as the elephant, where it's making intuitive, emotional, spur of the moment decisions as they move forward. And then the other half is what the Heath brothers refer to as the rider, that's in the image of you perched on the back of the elephant, clinging on for dear life, desperately trying to steer by the elephant's ears towards a less worse decision, is probably a pretty good illustration of, your other half of your brain giving cognitive control. And we think about a lot of this within, behavior change and behavioral economics, but it's certainly true with legislators and even companies doing outreach to their purchasers and their customers. Ultimately, people are looking for an emotional, compelling narrative to fill their lives, and then they're looking for just enough facts around them to keep the rider happy and prevent the rider from steering the elephant off a cliff or stopping them altogether.
Lots more great questions coming in, Evan. The next one is there an evolutionary reason for why our human values are the way they are?
That is a fascinating question. I actually didn't look into that as part of the research, but there's a very clear evolutionary reason why stories are so effective. Stories are quite literally survival instruments. For instance, Glog comes back from being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, so he sits around a fire and tells the story. For those of people who took the story and internalized it as if it happened to them, they're much more likely to survive the next saber-toothed tiger attack than those who barely paid attention or didn't get emotionally involved. So as a result, on the storytelling, there's a very clear evolutionary pullback. I don't have a good answer to you on the basic human values aspect of this as in regards to evolution, but it's a fascinating question, which I will now look up and then punish my students next semester with lectures on.
We have a question about social distance. What are some examples of things that work to decrease the sense of social distance?
Yeah, I gave, there's a lot of examples in the book, so definitely go through and download that. I think the easiest examples are the ones that I mentioned. Any time where before you tell a story, you start trying to feature how boy or girl next door the beneficiary is, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to reduce social distance. That's the little Jimmy loves to play soccer, or Susie loves science. They're trying to pick things that makes us feel like we are similar or close or related to them. You don't really see that many people saying, little Susie loves particle physics, or even little Susie loves broccoli, because they're not featuring, those are things that not all of us feel a closeness and relatedness to. They're instead looking for something a bit more universal. Other things that people often play up is the familial nature. Anytime you're talking about beneficiaries in a foreign country, you always get lots of time spent on how they're a hardworking parent who loves their kids, because that's a universal value. Every single one of us who is, hopefully every one of us who is a parent loves their kids. So they push up that aspect as well. So definitely definitely download the book and look for more examples there. But any part of the beneficiary that you can feature that is similar to other people, similar to you, similar to me, that's what they're going to talk up in these stories if we're going to be successful.
We have a great question from Elise about the political climate. So her question is, how, if at all, has the recent social political climate impacted people's response to emotional pleas? Are people more numb to strong messaging now or more reactive?
That is a fascinating question. I think when I hear current political situation, what I think immediately about is the need for positivity. Maybe 5 years ago, we would have been no, 5 years ago, wasn't it? 20 years ago, we would have been in a situation where we would have stood out if we were negative. But right now, so much of the news, so much of the discourse is so overwhelmingly negative that nonprofit organizations can actually stand out with their messaging and resonate with people in an authentic way by being positive, by showing them that there's actually hope in the world, that, we can work together, come together, and do things to make the world a better place. I actually, I don't think I really wrote about this in the book, but I actually am optimistic about our political system because of social science. If you dig in at all about the differences between the generations, Gen Xers who are just now, like Paul Ryan is a Gen Xer, Barack Obama was a Gen Xer, are starting to come into the ascendancy, and some of the baby boomers, which have a reputation for being more firebrands, are starting to they're getting older. They're not going to be around forever. Gen Xers have a reputation for being much more focused on, just leave me alone, let me do my work. Paul Ryan wants to head up the budget committee and really, like do my budget. I don't want to run for speaker. Barack Obama was like, let me do policy stuff, stop distracting me with this other stuff, and I can fix these problems. And I think a little bit more of that, where there's that level of pragmatism, and there are more Paul Ryans and Barack Obamas that are willing to reach across the aisle. I'm actually more optimistic now than maybe, I'm not more optimistic today than I was 2 years ago, but I do believe that this is not a pivot towards an even greater round of negativity. I feel like this is something where we are seeing the last gasps of an old system, and that the next generation is going to be much more pragmatic and do a much better job of coming together.
Evan, here's my own follow-up. What did you learn about brain science from working for Bernie Sanders? I threw you a curveball there.
Yeah, that is a curveball. Not a single person works harder, in my experience, than Bernie Sanders did, which made it a really exciting 3 years in the sense of it's 10 o'clock at night and all of us are falling asleep at our desks, and Bernie, God bless his dear soul, is still charging ahead. So I don't know that I necessarily got a lot out of brain science out of that, but I did see how he was the center of a constituency, and he bent over backwards to communicate and message with that constituency. He was probably a little more facts and figures than I think maybe some of the things that we're talking here, but he did come up with that empathy and authentic connection by always being out in the district, always talking to people, always hearing their stories, always making them feel good about themselves. And honestly, that's not unique to Bernie. That's, the 20% of politicians on Capitol Hill who do politics really well and really authentically, they all have that characteristic. And I think that's part of the reason why I'm optimistic about the future.
We have a question about ethics. Can you speak a little bit about how ethics fits into this? Where do you draw the line in the sand? How do you make sure this doesn't become manipulative and unethical?
Yeah, I think one of the great things that comes about talking about this social science and neurology and human behavior and even behavioral economics is it really causes us to think about who we are and what makes people tick. So there is a dark side here, though. I mean, what we're talking about here isn't that big of a difference between what used car salesmen do to get us to buy things that we don't want. So I think ultimately just because we can push a button to trigger a response doesn't mean that we should. And I think ultimately everybody has to make the ethics determination for themselves. At Georgetown, we spend a lot of time talking to our students about how to be ethical and how to come up with their own code of ethics that they're willing to follow. And I think everybody who reads this actually kind of has to do the same things. From altruism to empathy to efficacy, all of those things will be counterproductive, maybe even amoral if we don't do it authentically and with our supporters' best interest in mind.
Our next question is about those of us who work on international issues. Do you have any tips on appealing to the empathy of U.S. domestic donors when the organization's work focuses on international human rights issues that many donors probably have not lived through themselves?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really interesting portion of the project. We actually talked with several people who did international work, and one of the things that actually surprised me, I guess it shouldn't surprise me, but one of the things that I wasn't expecting was that veterans are actually one of the larger donor segments for international relief organizations. And one of the reasons why that's the case is they've been on the ground and they've been in foreign countries and they know what it's like to see a war-torn area, and they have an incredible amount of empathy for the people that they have met overseas and the people who are like the people that they've met overseas. So I think number one thing that I would say for international relief and international aid organizations is rethink a little bit about what your core constituency is. I don't know necessarily that I've heard a heck of a lot of my friends in international aid organizations say, hey, we're going out and we're going to talk to veterans because they're a segment. And obviously, I'm sure veterans aren't the only segment, but I think all of us needs to do a better job of looking beyond the segments that we've already identified. I think the second thing that I would say is the positivity. I think besides Sarah McLachlan, international AIDS organizations are often, I hope Sarah McLachlan isn't on this call because she's going to be very upset with me. I feel like international aid organizations are often the ones that spend the most time or have the most negativity incorporated in their messaging. And to some extent, I can see why that happens. If we're talking about, short-term, get money quickly, burn people out, then a international crisis is probably not that far off from a political campaign. It's going to be over in 6 months, so get as much money as you can right now. But unfortunately, what that doesn't do is it doesn't build a broad base of support for helping people, every day moving forward. And you get into a situation, not unlike the Red Cross, where the vast majority of their donors are coming from emergency work. And I'm trying to think of what year it was. It might have been 2014, but international aid relief was down significantly, maybe 6%, maybe 10% that year. Because there weren't any natural disasters. And none of us really want to be in a situation where we're rooting for a natural disaster in order to make our budget numbers.
We have a couple of questions coming in about efficacy. Antonio asked, could you explain a little bit more in depth efficacy and give a couple examples on how to use it effectively?
Yeah, efficacy is really about stewardship, and it's really about reporting back on the good works that your donor has made possible. And by doing so, we are demonstrating that we are effective and that the supporter will be effective if they choose to donate to us. So a donor isn't going to donate to any nonprofit organization unless they're not going to give $10 to the Nature Conservancy to stop a baby seal from being clubbed unless they actually believe that that $10 will stop the baby seal from being clubbed. And that is efficacy in a slightly flippant sort of way. What the important thing for the nonprofit to keep in mind is really around stewardship. We need to tell our supporters 20 times after their donation, you did this, and by doing this, you made this possible. You gave $10, and there are more baby seals in the world now because of that. That makes the donor feel effective. It gives us an opportunity to thank our supporters, which helps them bond with our organization. And it also gives us the ability, we talked really early on in the presentation about how we're not the protagonist, they're not the protagonist. But when we talk about stewardship, we actually can spend some time saying, hey, you saved these baby seals, but we helped. And without us, baby seals would not be in such a good place as what they are today. So not only are we helping them feel effective, but we're helping them feel as if our organizations are effective. So every single story that we tell or every single article that we write should have something in it that is making the supporter feel like they're effective, and that we have taken either the support we've gotten in the past and we've turned it into something great that has had real world impact.
Jennifer, you're sending in so many great questions. Feel free to send in more. She asks, with the tax reform, most Americans have lost the tax-friendly financial incentive to donate. How do we use altruism to continue to incentivize them?
Yeah, this is one of those things where if you put 10 social scientists into a room, you'll get 15 different opinions, and probably 5 of them will be punching each other. I don't necessarily know that there's going to be a big impact from the tax reform, at least not in the lower dollar donations. Well, this is my best guess, at least, and I'll give you all my cell phone number and you can call me in 2 years when I've proven to be completely wrong. But especially in the lower tax brackets, I think it's a little weird to think that people are sitting around in December going, I could make a $50 donation and that will save me 73 cents, I made that number up, on my taxes in a couple of months. That's not really how the human brain typically works. I think what the tax deductible language is primarily used for is actually urgency. A lot of organizations don't have great urgency. Climate change is a wonderful example of something that's got seriousness, but it's not like the world is ending tomorrow if it's not fixed. So they don't have great urgency. So a lot of organizations are trying to find urgency to get people to give today as opposed to giving to tomorrow. And I actually feel like in December, that's really what the tax deductible contribution stuff is. It's a nonprofit organization trying to get urgency there. And I think it's a little bit of hand waving in the sense of we don't have great urgency, so we're going to talk about tax deductibility because that says that gives us the opportunity to say only 3 days left to give, only 2 days left to give, only 1 day left to give, and that causes more people to give than not give. So anyway, call me in 18 months after the fundraising market for nonprofits is cratered, but I am cautiously optimistic that the tax bill isn't really going to have an impact, at least not on most of our organizations doing, membership and kind of low to mid-dollar fundraising.
Our next question comes from Raphael, who's asking about if there's any variation of engagement with new NGOs versus older established ones. So he asks, do people think that more established NGOs do not need support because they are well established, or do they think that because they are well established, they could be trusted or supported? Is there any research about this problem of NGOs that are, quote, aging and the differences with the new ones?
Yeah, I think all of the above. I think what it'll work out to, and honestly, if I write fellowship number 2, it would probably be on the differences in generations in giving. I think this is probably ultimately a generational question. You know, my grandparents, when they give, they would no sooner give to like a charity water that didn't exist 5 years ago, because they were looking for a blue chip organization that's been around forever that the Rockefellers gave to. And that was something that was really interesting to them. And that was part of what made them feel like their support to an organization would be valid and useful, and you know, would ultimately be effective at changing whatever it is on the ground. Nowadays, you know, you don't see a lot of 25-year-olds wanting to go to work for IBM anymore. You know, that blue chip aspect of it has lost some of its allure. I think my generation is probably part of that problem because we were inherently untrusting of institutions. Millennials are actually much more trusting of institutions, according to Pew and other people who measure these things, than Gen Xers are by far. But we're still significantly down from the view that big, huge organizations are going to make a difference. So as a result, you'll see a lot of big blue chip organizations talking about the work they do in local communities to try and bring their massiveness down to a scale that younger generations will find a bit more interesting. And I think younger organizations that don't have that blue chip nature, they've got a lot of advantages. Number one, they're probably not trying to run a direct mail program at this point, but they are probably going to pull from younger audiences, and frankly, they're going to suffer a little bit from in the money that they get until their audiences get older and older. Younger people just have less money to give and less disposable income. So I'm sure many of these younger organizations are waiting for their constituencies to, for their constituencies' kids to go off to college and them to have more disposable income and to retire and, you know, leave lots of money to them in the will. But that's going to be, you know, 10, 20 years away for a lot of these littler organizations. So it's probably both or all of the above.
We have time for two very quick questions in our last couple of minutes together. Suzanne asks, I work for a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization in which scientists are very careful about ensuring that what is presented is evidence-based. How do you suggest that we put a human side to some of the drier evidence-based reports?
Yes, I actually spent several years of my life on this exact same question. I didn't actually use the climate change example by accident. I was actually involved in a lot of projects with AAAS and other people working on climate to frankly address that exact same issue. And it is very hard to get scientists to let go of what makes them scientists. I mean, that is exactly what makes them a scientist. So we did a lot of message training with them. We spent an awful lot of time explaining to them the ramifications of being overly cautious in this area. And also there are a lot of organizations out there, Urban Institute's actually a pretty good example, that are letting scientists be scientists, but then are producing other types of content to support the science report. So instead of just the science report being released and there being a press release accompanied with them, they're turning it into an interactive video feature. They're breaking it up into several blog posts. They're actually going out and interviewing actual people who are impacted by these big policy ideas and telling their specific stories. So in that particular case, they're letting the scientists and the researchers be the scientists and researchers they need to be, but they're doing a completely other level of content above and around it to help demystify some of that and to tell better stories and take advantage of the altruism, empathy, and efficacy stuff that we're talking about.
And really quickly, Evan, this is a good question to conclude on. Out of all the research that you have done with this work, what results or insight did you find most surprising?
Oh, wow. God, can I say everything?
It's like a question, which is your favorite child?
Yeah, which is my favorite child? Hi, Kate. Hi, Rory. Honestly, I think if I'm going to go meta here, I was actually surprised at how much of the research that I did showed that we all knew what we should be doing. And I say that in a way of saying, we all know we should be thanking people. We don't typically do a great job at thanking people because we're pressed for time, so we thank them once and we let it go instead of thanking them 6 times. I think we all know that we need to teach better story or tell better stories. It's just so much easier to use the exact same facts and figures over and over and over again as opposed to go out and finding dozens of people whose stories we can feature. And I think I knew, did you guys know? I think I knew that like pure altruism is a purity test. And that maybe that wasn't going to really work out as well as we thought it was going to be. But again, it's so much easier to do what we've done, for the last 20 years, 40 years, 60 years, etc. So I think the thing that I took away from this in the aggregate is that we, by and large, I feel like what we know what needs to be done, and what we really need, and what I've tried to do in this book is give us really simple, easy, pragmatic ways to actually act on the stuff that we hope or know to be true.
Evan, I'm going to take your advice and end on a thank you. So thanks to you for all your work on this project, for leading our webinar today, and thanks to everyone on the line for spending an hour with us. And if the Center for Social Impact Communication can ever be a resource to you, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks for joining us today.